Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good day to everyone. My name is Nazari Ismail and I'm the director of the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies at University of Malaya. Welcome to today's webinar in which we will discuss the implications of the United Nations Security Council's resolution calling on Israel to implement a ceasefire in Gaza. As we are all aware, the Israeli genocide in Gaza since early October last year has cost the lives of more than 33,000 Palestinians. More than 75,000 have been injured and 80% of Gaza's population has been displaced. Starvation, famine, and destruction of health infrastructure are all aspects of this genocide aimed at annihilating Palestinians in Gaza. Fortunately, there has been some progress at the United Nations as far as protecting the Palestinians is concerned. The first one was the decision by the principal judicial organ of the United Nations, which is the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, which ruled on January 26 this year to admit the application by the South African government to charge Israel with genocide. And the ICJ issued provisional measures demanding Israel not commit acts of plausible genocide. The second progress was the publication by the Office of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Occupied Palestinian Territories, Francesca Albanese, and she produced a report which stated that there are reasonable grounds to believe Israel is committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. The third progress was the United Nations Security Council decision to pass a resolution for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. This actually was a significant decision given the United States' previous failure to pass a similar resolution using its vetoes, of course. The fourth progress was the adoption of the resolution by the United Nations Human Rights Council that was on April 5th, calling for Israel to be held accountable for possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Gaza and demanding a halt to all arms sales to the country. However, until now, Israel has not stopped its killing sprees in Gaza and also the West Bank. Israel was even willing to carry out targeted killings of 7 staff of the US-based aid group World Central Kitchen earlier this month. It seemed that the UNSC resolution and other resolutions by the UN-related bodies mean absolutely nothing to Israel. And to add salt to the wounds of the Palestinians, on the day of Eid itself, Israel assassinated 3 children of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh and also his grandchildren. The killings are, of course, illegal without doubt because they were all non-combatants. But this is not really a surprise because almost all the 33,000 Palestinians killed so far in Gaza were also non-combatants. In the meantime, Israel's partners in this genocide, the US, Britain, Germany, and Australia, have continued to provide military assistance to Israel to enable it to continue to carry out its genocidal crimes. So, what is the purpose of the UNSC and other UN bodies passing resolutions on Palestine? In fact, what is the purpose of having the UN at all if the organization is incapable of preventing the killing of tens of thousands of innocent women and children in front of the whole world in real time? Well, we have invited 2 experts to share their views to answer this question and also to help us understand what is happening and what may happen in the future. And we have with us today, firstly, is Dr. Peter Slizak, who is an honorary associate professor in philosophy at the University of New South Wales. He is also the co-founder of the independent Australian Jewish Voices an executive member of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, and a member of the Committee of Advisors, the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Malaya. Peter obtained his BA from the University of New South Wales and his Master's in Philosophy and PhD in Philosophy from Columbia University in the United States. And we also have with us today Professor Saul Takahashi. Professor Takahashi teaches human rights law at Osaka Jogakuin University in Japan, Osaka, Japan. His previous positions include as a refugee officer at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. He was also the drug control officer at the Secretariat of the International Narcotics Control Board and the deputy head of office in the occupied Palestine for the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. He has authored numerous publications in English and in Japanese, and he holds a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Essex, a diploma in refugee studies, and also from the University of Oxford, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Western philosophy from Waseda University. Welcome to both of you, Peter Slezak and Paul Takahashi.
Thanks, Professor Nazami.
Okay, so let's start. Let's get our discussion going. I will start with you first, Peter. So, as I mentioned just now, the United Nations Security Council recently passed a resolution asking Israel to implement a ceasefire. But Israel is still killing people, including aid workers, right? What is happening? Is the United Nations completely toothless when it comes to Israel? What can we expect from the United Nations? Can we expect anything at all from them or not? Go ahead.
Well,
Peter.
look, it's a good question. Professor Saul Takahashi can be giving a more expert advice from the point of view of a scholar, but it's pretty obvious that the UN, especially from the Security Council, can't do anything while the United States abstains even. When it abstains, at least, the motion in this case went through, but they declared that it wasn't binding. Now, that's really undermining the UN and international law. I mean, normally they will actually dissent and be the exception to other countries who will vote for resolutions. In this case, even when they abstain and they allow the motion to go through, the other thing is that even when the motion goes through, obviously it doesn't have an effect, as you rightly note, on Israel, and that's because there's no enforcement mechanism. Unless there's some other mechanism that's provided, they can't enforce their rulings, and this depends on other nations. As during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, other nations have to resort to force when they wish, and even if they get the United Nations sanction, they still have to decide. Now, that's not even the remotest possibility as far as I see in Israel, but they could withhold arms. The United States is still providing the arms. And so the international community is not acting strongly enough. In fact, here in Australia, where I am, after months of refusing to even condemn what Israel is doing, finally the foreign minister came out and expressed the view that that Israel should have a ceasefire, but also should recognize the statehood of Palestine. Well, this is too little and too late. It's really depressing that they come to this point after 30 or 40,000 dead in Gaza, and when the possibility of a state for Palestine has essentially disappeared. There are 700,000 settlers, illegal settlers in the West Bank, and she didn't raise her voice. The foreign minister didn't say a word in all these years. And now when there's a genocide in Gaza, now she decides that we should talk about a statehood and the two-state solution. This is a farce, and it's a kind of an embarrassment. And it's really a kind of a charade, and it's gaslighting, as they say. This is kind of empty posturing, where they are pretending that there's some prospect of changing things meaningfully by these empty gestures. That's basically what we're finding. And I have to say, just recently, you'll be following what Germany is doing. And among the states around the world, it's disgraceful that Germany is acting to suppress any dissent, any protest. Recently, in relation to Gaza, they just prevented Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta, who has been in Gaza. They prevented him from even entering Germany to speak. This is so shocking, of all countries, Germany that has such historic guilt, for them to now be acting. And in one way or another, the nations around the world are all perhaps behaving this way. One other comment I'll say, in Australia, it's rather remarkable, perhaps elsewhere, now that our foreign minister has even made these lame and quite inadequate remarks, the Israel lobby, the Jewish community, have become hysterical. They've become completely apoplectic that the foreign minister has now stabbed Israel in the back. This is kind of comedy if it wasn't so tragic. It's really a farce. So now the foreign minister is losing on all sides. You know, we've been very critical. The pro-Palestine community has been harshly critical of the foreign minister and the prime minister. But now she's come out and made these lame, pathetic statements. Now the Zionist community are apoplectic with anger at her. So, I mean, she deserves it, frankly.
All right. Thank you, Peter, for that initial comments. Now, Saul, so you are very familiar with the United Nations setup. You worked at the United Nations before. You have, well, there was some criticism by you of the United Nations, but still, by and large, I think you have hope for the United Nations and so the international legal framework. What's your comment on the situation now? Go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thanks very much for that, Nazari. I mean, you asked, your question was, is the UN toothless, and what's the point? What's the whole point of the UN if it can't, if it can't do anything in the face of clear and obvious genocide that's going on before our eyes and the eyes of the entire world? And you said, what's the point? And I wanted to say, well, I ask myself that every day. It is very, I mean, on a personal level, it's kind of depressing for me. Which is not, important at all in the broad scheme of things. But it is quite depressing to look at something which, I feel like I've dedicated pretty much my entire career to, the international legal framework and the United Nations and all these kind of things, and to watch them, just lose any kind of semblance of credibility and legitimacy. One thing that, it is important to stress is that people think of the UN Security Council in particular, and the UN in general, as a collective security framework that was built to ensure security for the entire world. And there's some truth to that, but by and large, it was never really the point. I mean, we had the powerful countries that won World War II. Most of them wanted business as usual. Certainly, the British and the French, they assumed that they were going to maintain their colonies and everything was just going to be, hunky-dory, and just, they're going to go back to business as usual. And the structures of the UN really were created with that in mind. They were created to ensure that the most the victorious, powerful countries, that their interests were protected. And that's not to say that the UN has not accomplished anything, of course, since it was created, and that it, the whole thing is ridiculous and that we should throw everything out. But for sure, that is being thrown in our faces in a very stark way with what we see now happening in Palestine. And the double standards are just so, outrageous, just so stinking to high heaven, that it just, it's beyond belief. We look at how the United States and how its European allies have been going around, running around like chickens with their heads cut off about Ukraine, and how, Ukrainian resistance to Russian occupation, they're freedom fighters and they must be supported by any decent human being. It's self-evident. And then when it comes to what, a clear case of genocide, what my former colleague Craig described as a textbook case of genocide. Yeah. Going on in front of in clear sight of the entire world, and all of a sudden, they're full throttled in support of the occupier, the Israeli right to self-defense, which does not exist in international law against an occupied population. All this kind of nonsense. So all of this is it is outrageous. But I think what's happening now is really exposing in a way which you know, at a much higher level. It's exposing at a much higher level the hypocrisy and double standards that are basically built into the international system that we have now. And I think that you know, it's outrageous and terrible that it's being done on the basis of such massacres and killings in Gaza. But it's you know, I think that it will lead, inshallah, to something different. I mean, it will lead to some sort of different system being built. You know, I look also just on another note. It's you know, we've been focusing on the UN, what's happening in the hallways of the UN in New York and Geneva, but I also want to point to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. You know, which is a sick joke. I mean, it's just it's outrageous. I mean, it is really outrageous that the chief prosecutor is still in his job. I mean, I just don't understand this. He's got to get off his behind and issue you know, arrest warrants for the people who are clearly committing, you know, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, the whole lot. And you know, nothing is happening. This is really outrageous. The South Africans, you know, what the South Africans have been doing, they went to the International Court of Justice, and now the Namibians have also, excuse me, the Nicaraguans have also filed a suit against Germany in the International Court of Justice. And all of these are, you know, they're good things. I mean, they are movements towards holding Israel accountable, and that's really what has to happen. But, you know, none of this would be necessary if the International Criminal Court was doing its job. None of this would have to happen if, you know, arrest warrants had been issued for Israeli political and military leaders, like should have happened months ago, years ago even. But it's not been happening, and that's really, it really is outrageous. And you know, the hypocrisy is being exposed at a level which, you know, the hypocrisy of the United States in particular, and certainly of the Europeans, is not new, but it's being exposed at a level which is much, much higher than before. And I think, you know, I think we really are going to see some very serious changes in the international system as a whole. And I certainly hope, inshallah, that they will be positive changes, and they will be you know, changes towards a much more just system, representative of the world that we live in, and representative of the people. That you know, the people of the world. But certainly, you know, the massacres have to stop. The genocide has to stop. Genocide in Palestine has to stop, and it has to stop now. And you know, for that to happen, of course, we all know what needs to happen. The Americans have to stop the Israelis. That's really what it is. You know, the UN is at the end of the day, it is toothless. With not just with regards to Israel, unfortunately, but certainly on this issue, it is more toothless than even in usual, just because the most powerful country in the world, the United States, just refuses to allow any kind of action, any kind of serious action, to hold Israel accountable. And until that changes, it will change. But you know, until that changes, you know, it's very depressing. But this is, you know, it's very difficult to see a serious improvement in the immediate term. Thanks.
Nazari, can I jump in and ask a question from Saul?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
What you say is very important and depressing about the ICC. A remark and a question. You may be aware that the first national leader that's been referred to the ICC is the Australian Prime Minister. 100 lawyers have actually referred him as an accessory to genocide under the Genocide Convention, which is wonderful. I mean, that means that not just Israeli leaders, but other leaders are legally liable. Now, and of course, this is too little and too late and too slow, but and it doesn't help the tragic loss of the Gazan Palestinians. But I think maybe that's at least putting people on notice. The other question I actually have is, you'd be aware that years ago, or during, perhaps after the Vietnam War, there was the famous Russell Tribunal, where Jean-Paul Sartre and Russell instituted a tradition of these people's tribunals, and they held serious hearings. And subsequently, I think it was in the same tradition, the former American U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark held a war crimes tribunal. These were extraordinary because he was a former U.S. Attorney General, so he wasn't, you know, a lefty. He wasn't Noam Chomsky, and he put on trial Norman Schwarzkopf, you know, Colin Powell, President Bush, and he found them guilty in this serious hearings of Nuremberg-style war crimes for which we hanged a lot of Germans, Nazis, after the Second World War. So my question really is whether, given what we're agreeing that, and your remarks that the UN is toothless, is there a place for a people's tribunal that could perhaps act as those earlier ones did?
Yeah. So go ahead.
For sure, I think there's a place for these kind of, for the people's tribunals and for these kind of, actions on the part of the citizenry. And that's really what is going to bring about change in the United States and in the European countries and pretty much in all the countries in the world. And we see that. I mean, we see Biden very subtly and I mean, the whole sort of media narrative about Biden finally getting tough on Netanyahu has been basically smoke and mirrors, because he hasn't really done anything. Again, it's just been sort of pretend. But the fact that he feels that he even has to sort of pretend shows that he is feeling the pressure, and he's feeling the pressure because of domestic politics, because of American voters abandoning him in droves, because of what he's doing. He's being everywhere he goes, he's being heckled as Genocide Joe. Genocide Joe has got to go. This is the call that we see in a lot of these demonstrations. So of course those citizen tribunals are very important. The boycott movement is ultra important. All of these actions on the part of the citizenry are very important, and they really are what they are already bringing about change, and they are going to bring about change really very much. The writing is on the wall. I mean, that's very, very, very clear, I think. And that's precisely why the Zionists in places like the United States and the UK, and I think also Australia, have been going crazy over the past few years, in particular since last October, of course. But in recent years, they've been, taking the whole, what they're doing to really, really extreme levels, trying to ban the boycott movement, trying to get legislation passed that would basically prohibit any kind of criticism of the state of Israel, all these kind of clearly undemocratic, clearly sort of violative actions that they've been doing. They do this because they see that they're losing. I mean, they have basically, and certainly since last October, they have lost what people often call the battle of the public narrative, because it's so obvious. It's just so obvious what Israel is doing. It's just undeniable.
If I could add quickly, even in the Jewish community in Australia, it's very different. But in America, the Jewish community is splitting seriously on this.
Yes.
They're very progressive. They're at the forefront of the civil rights movement, and they are not like the Australian Jews, who mostly post-war migrants. They've got a long tradition of commitment to human rights. They're Democrat voters, unlike here. And so their progressive values are having a hard time now for some years reconciling with what Israel is doing. And that's an important element in American politics. People like Peter Beinart have openly been very important in being critical, and even to the extent of now rejecting the very idea of a Jewish state. That was a bombshell. Nothing like that is happening in Australia.
Okay. So when you mentioned about the People's Tribunal just now, since the official platforms sanctioned by international law cannot do anything, of course the People's Tribunal will not be able to do anything also, right? But what may come out of it is basically moral support, I suppose, educating the public more than anything. Right? Basically, you can't get anything done officially. No enforcement, of course, since the United Nations does not have any enforcement mechanism. The People's Tribunal, of course, will have no enforcement mechanism at all. But the value is still there. That's what I want to ask both of you. So if you have no,
if I could, I could.
Go ahead.
I mean, like one of the things about, I mean, when we look at all these sort of mechanisms of international law, and it's true that in general they are not enforced in a sort of immediate sense, but just look, for example, at the ICJ order, the provisional measures order that the ICJ made. And the subsequent statements that the ICJ have made as well. They rely heavily on UN reports, UNRWA reports, which is probably one of the reasons that Israel sort of jumped on UNRWA immediately after the order for provisional measures. But the ICJ have been they've been, relying heavily on UN reports, UNRWA reports, I think UNICEF reports, I believe they were also citing. And, these are the reports that, a lot of people have been trashing for years. They've been just saying, look, there's no point in writing all these reports. Where are these going to go? What's going to happen? It doesn't amount to anything. And of course, yes, those are UN reports. But then we look at, for example, reports by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, the three big ones that have been calling, they have recognized Israeli practices as amounting to apartheid. Of course, Palestinians have been pointing that out for decades. And, it says something that, it's taken these international organizations that are populated mainly by Westerners, that has, that has taken that for, to have any serious impact. But it really has, changed the discourse. I mean, it is really changing the discourse it was as recently as 2017, for a UN report to even sort of mention the word apartheid, it was a huge scandal. You'll remember the UN Economic Commission in Southwest Asia. It was a huge scandal. But now it's really becoming mainstream to note Israel as an apartheid state. And Peter, like you mentioned, even a lot of American Jews now recognize Israel as an apartheid state. I mean, that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
And so, these kind of, these reports, these papers, these judgments, while they are not often, usually they're not enforceable, or they're not enforced in an immediate sense. And it's extremely frustrating, and it's dejecting. And, we need to keep on pushing for immediate enforcement. But, it's not, I do still believe that it's not the case that they amount to nothing.
No, of course.
They can amount to something, and they can make a difference.
The big difference, if I could add too, Saul, is that after the Second World War, the Allies won, and the Nuremberg trials were held by the victor. And at the moment, there's the victor. I mean, the Palestinians are not in the position to bring Israel and the Americans to a trial. They're not the winners in a strict sense.
Okay. I remember, Saul, when you were working at the United Nations, you got into trouble, right? Because you mentioned can you just relate the story a bit to us?
Well, yes, that was a very silly thing that happened. One thing that I do have to say is that, of course, the UN is a civil service, so people working in the UN at all times are sort of expected to uphold very high standards of impartiality, and that's that comes with the territory. I mean, you sign the contract, and that's just how it goes. Now, of course, we could get into. It's very easy to point out that neutrality or impartiality in the face of oppression is basically taking the side of the oppressor. But it is a civil service, and you sign on to it. I remember when I went to Palestine, there was a colleague from a different agency. He was not from the Human Rights Agency, but we were sort of chatting, and he said, look, as international civil servants, we all have to maintain the appearance and of impartiality. We always have to conduct ourselves, blah blah blah, as impartial civil servants. But if after 2 weeks in Palestine, you are still impartial in your heart, well, there's something wrong with you. That's how he put it, and it was a very apt way of putting it. But anyway, what happened was there were some American students who visited. They contacted our office, and they visited us. They came from I don't want to name the organization, but they came from actually, you could actually see it on the internet. It was from J Street. They came from J Street. This was after sort of shortly after J Street had been created. And they were going on a trip around Israel and the West Bank, and they wanted to come to our office and see, get our take on the situation. And I was tasked with briefing them and sort of giving them the UN Human Rights Agency line. Now, I have to say it was my fault. I mean, because they came from J Street, and again, this was just after J Street had been created. There was all this sort of hoo-ha about they were going to be a completely different organization from APEC. Everything, this was going to completely change the whole landscape. And so basically, I sort of I went outside the boundaries that UN civil servants would be expected to maintain. Let's put it that way. And I called settlers. We were talking about Hebron. I called the settlers whacked out nut jobs or something of that nature. Yeah. And one of the guys, the students who were there, and I remember who it was, and I certainly do not wish to ever see him again, though I do remember. I remember what he looks like. He wasn't even American. I remember he was a Dane. He was a Danish guy, but he was recording the whole thing. He was secretly recording the whole thing. And so I guess maybe a half day later, or I think it was that evening, I was featured in the J Post, the Jerusalem Post. You can look it up on the internet. The Saul Takahashi Jerusalem Post, settlers nut jobs or something. You'll find it. And they were, Saul Takahashi, senior UN staff, clearly not impartial, just like Richard Falk, this kind of thing. And it was potentially a big deal. I mean, it was let's just say that a lot of my superiors in Geneva were not happy. And I honestly don't think I would have lost my job, but I probably would have been pulled out had it gone further. But for some reason, it never appeared in the print version. It just sort of died out. To this day, I do not know why. I think, honestly, I think probably what it was is the editors to the print version got together the next morning, and they looked at it and they said, "Look, settlers are nut jobs. This ain't exactly news here." So I think that's probably why. But I honestly don't know. I honestly do not know why it didn't sort of develop into sort of bigger thing. But I got lucky. Many of my other UN colleagues were not so fortunate. Of course, Francesca recently, she is not now she was actually a UN civil servant when I was there, but she is not a UN civil servant. She's a special rapporteur, so an independent expert. And Israel never cooperates with independent, human rights procedures at the Human Rights Council. They have never cooperated with the special rapporteur. Again, Israel needs to be kicked out of the United Nations. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, they are a serial flouter of international law. They never cooperate with UN human rights, procedures or investigations. As a rule, they never cooperate. The whole condition of them being admitted to the UN was that they would implement UN resolutions, in particular regarding the return of refugees. Well, they haven't done it. Why are these people still sitting in these seats here? And that is, again, that's one of the problems with the United Nations. It's sort of conceptualized, not necessarily at the beginning, but it was, I would argue it's conceptualized in the minds of everybody now as a place where everybody can at least come and everybody can at least talk things through. And there is some merit to that. I mean, there's it's better that people come and talk about things than they're shooting each other, obviously. But when we have a serial violator of international law, so a country that as a rule just sort of thumbs its nose at international law, international human rights standards, the International Court of Justice ordered it to stop committing genocide and to let humanitarian aid in. What's it done? It's done nothing except massacre Gazans trying to get humanitarian aid, shoot at aid workers. So why is there no serious discussion of serious sanctions and really talk about kicking it out of the United Nations? This country, I'm sorry, honestly, there has to be serious discussion about whether it deserves to maintain its vote in the GA and its status as a UN member. There's just no I see no sort of legitimacy to this at all. Yeah. So that's really the situation, and it's outrageous.
Well, there is a precedent to that, because South Africa was suspended by the United Nations General Assembly before it eventually abandoned apartheid policies. But the UNGA did suspend South Africa, so there was a precedent. They can do the same thing. Somebody has to start the ball rolling, though. But I'm not sure who's going to do that. But let's come back to this issue. If you are an advisor to the Palestinians, of course, there are Palestinians that are divided. Also, you have the PA, and you have the Hamas supporters. But let's talk about, if you are advisor to the Palestinian Authority, to Mahmoud Abbas, what would be your advice to them in order to pursue their rights, to make things better, basically to liberate their country? What would be your advice to the official Palestinian representative? Just some words. I just want to know your thoughts about.
To whom are you directing the
Both
question?
of you, actually. Peter, you can go first. Peter, yeah.
Well, I'll give the non-expert answer, and Saul can give the more informed answer. Look, the first thing to say, if you're asking what advice you want to give to the PA and Mahmoud Abbas, it's no secret that they are corrupt, they are collaborators, they are complicit in outsourcing the occupation for Israel. This is not a secret. Even the New York Times, Diana Buttu ran a column in the editorial pages of the New York Times. The peace process has been a fraud from the beginning. So the PA should not be parties to any future resolution of the problem. The trouble is that that's the direction in which the rhetoric is going. They demonize Hamas, and it doesn't deserve the rhetoric it's getting. That's a whole separate discussion. And by asking about the PA, it just invites the question that the PA should not be a party to any future discussions. Now, it's complicated because in practice, the PA runs the West Bank. I mean, the civil society, all of the agencies and the health and everything else. I once said to a Palestinian, they should just get rid of the PA. He said, it's not that easy, which is probably right. But what I'm saying is important. The PA ought not to be taken as representative of the Palestinian people. By the way, just while I'm talking, it's interesting to watch, I think, a heroic figure, the ambassador to the UK, Hussam Zomlot, who speaks eloquently and powerfully and one of the most important voices. But when the question of Hamas comes up, he kind of fudges a little bit because he says, we're the representative of the Palestinian people. But the reality is, I understand, if there was an election even today, apart from the fact that Hamas was elected in the West Bank and in Gaza, today, if there was an election, Hamas would be elected. So the PA are very problematic, and I think that has to be understood. And it's part of the problem that we're facing.
So in other words, because they don't deserve to exist in the first place, there's no point in giving any advice to them.
They don't need advice. They know exactly what the problem is. I mean, they're collaborators, and they're outsourcing. They're arresting people. They're repressing dissent among the Palestinians. Any resistance that's emerging in some places, I understand in Jenin and various places, they are actually acting to violently suppress any dissent within the Palestinian community in the West Bank. So this is not a solution for the future.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Saul, any comment? If you are an advisor.
I'm completely on the same page as Peter. I mean, the PA is just a bunch of collaborators who are there precisely because, they agreed to be collaborators. I mean, the whole Oslo process is a sham. It was a sham from the beginning. It was based on, basically the PLO and the people, this sort of group of Palestinian elites who were concerned that they were being excluded from what was going on in Palestine. They had been forcibly kicked out, a long while before that, and they the first Intifada and the whole sort of popular uprising had been conducted without their sort of leadership. So they were concerned about this, and so what their great idea was: okay, we will abandon armed struggle. We will even the option of armed struggle. We will abandon our goal of liberating all of Palestine and sort of live with 22% of the land. And for those huge concessions, which no national independence movement really has ever made, because it would be it's monumentally stupid to do it. They were, the good boys and girls of the PA were given these, were thrown these bones. They were basically allowed to be the collaborator authority within that 22% of land. And the Palestinian people, they see through this, of course. I mean, certainly when I was there already, this was between 2009 2014, but when I was there, my Palestinian colleagues would often sort of say, and only half jokingly, that the third Intifada will be against the PA. But the whole the PA basically only is propped up now precisely because of the quote unquote security coordination with Israel, which is, what is that? That is basically, they are arresting Palestinians, dissenters, people who do not agree with the Oslo process, people who do not agree with these one-sided concessions by the Palestinians, and people who want, to liberate all of Palestine, and anybody who speaks out against the PA, basically. And they are arresting these people on the behest of the Israelis quite often, and torturing them. It's really, it really is, the kind of typical sort of model that we see in colonial situations, where the colonial oppressors, do not want to be seen as ruling the people directly. So they hire basically. They hire collaborators and sort of to strong arm them into doing the dirty work, and that's what the PA exists to do, and that's what they're doing. So they really have zero credibility. I mean, amongst the Palestinian people, first and foremost. But so it really is. This is just another one of the many outrages in the way that the PA is presented, like for example in the international media or by our so-called leaders, like Biden and the Europeans, who expect somehow that, by magic, the PA is going to more neoliberal reforms that will, that will benefit Israeli companies and Western companies, and somehow they will gain legitimacy and they will sort of march into Gaza and everything is going to be fine. I don't know what kind of pipe dream these people are living off of, but this is not going to fly. I mean, no Palestinian will accept it. And even the PA, at least at first, was saying that it would never go return to Gaza on the back of an Israeli tank, though sort of developments within the PA sort of suggest that they are in fact preparing for that. I wouldn't call it an eventuality, but they're preparing for the possibility. But so, in answer to the question, I would never be an advisor for the PA. I don't think they'd hire me anyway. But, it would be too, I couldn't do it. I mean, it'd just be too sickening. I will prostitute myself and work for the UN, or at least I did. But work for the PA, this is a bridge too far for me, I think. Yeah. I mean, I'm never going to work for the UN either, but anyway. Yeah.
What you're saying is extremely interesting. Edward Said saw through it immediately. He has an essay called The Morning After. It's like a day after they signed the Oslo Agreement. And he pointed to what a betrayal the Oslo Agreement was. And it led to where we are today. And he saw it immediately.
Yes, quite amazing, because, I mean, certainly not all of us did see through it immediately. I mean, I think there was a lot of, a lot of sort of presentation of this as being at least the first step towards some kind of lasting peace and all that, but it was a farce. I mean, it was a shame.
Yeah.
Okay, so in that case, then, if you are asked to advise the general Palestinian population as a whole, Palestinians, this is, of course, it's theoretical, but just want to know thoughts. If you want to advise the Palestinians as a whole, how are they going to achieve their freedom and their rights in the future? What should they do as a group? What is it resistance or what that you want to advise them to do in the future? Any
I'll leave that to you, Saul.
Well, I mean, look, the time I would argue that the time that the Palestinians really came, I wouldn't say came the closest, but the time that they achieved the most may have been the time of the First Intifada. And this was not this was an uprising that was not sort of, planned and organized and directed by particular factions. It was really, very much a popular uprising where, popular committees were created all throughout Palestine and run in a very democratic way. And they organized, all sorts of different types of resistance. It included armed resistance, of course, and it needs to be stressed that subjugated peoples, colonized peoples, have the right to armed resistance against their colonial oppressor. But it wasn't just that. I mean, there's all sorts of different nonviolent resistance that the Palestinians did and continue to do, to this day. It wasn't just during the time of the first Intifada. So, I do believe that, that sort of holds, I wouldn't say it holds the key, but it shows a potential, one of the paths forward. I mean, I think, one of the I wouldn't say one of the problems with one of the issues with what's going on is that you have these factions. Certainly the PA is corrupt. Collaborators completely out of the question. Hamas is completely demonized and ostracized, which is a problem in and of itself. That should not be taking place. But it's not just, we shouldn't rely just on the factions. It should. I think that these kind of popular uprisings might have more. They might have more effect. And honestly, I believe most of the Palestinians I speak with feel the same way. Most of the Palestinians I speak with are not. They're pretty disenchanted with a lot of the factions. And they believe that popular uprising and popular resistance in all sorts of forms, again, not just armed resistance, that's probably one of the most effective ways forward.
Thank you, Saul. So we have 10 more minutes left for our conversation. I just want to ask this question to both of you again. How do you see the scenario playing out in the coming months and years, and how to make ourselves be more optimistic? What's going to happen, and how do we improve things? Okay, go ahead, Peter.
That's a tough question. I don't know if anybody has any real way to predict. I mean, Gaza has been destroyed. It can't just go back to where they were before. The people can't even go back to their homes. I mean, there's nothing left, effectively. I mean, I don't know, some huge percentage of the houses are destroyed or unlivable, not to mention the death toll. So what to do with Gaza is really a serious question. If the world would attempt to reconstruct. I mean, one perhaps good thing is that Egypt didn't allow them to leave, so that in a way they can't be ethnically cleansed out of Gaza, as some of them say they don't want to leave because they'll die there. They prefer to die in Gaza. How to reconstruct Gaza is an immense question, which I have no answers for, but that's obviously got to be done. I mean, enormous amounts of aid and help has to come in there. Once Israel is prevented from continuing this horrible genocide. So I don't have any answers. I don't know anybody. One thing I might say that struck me in relation to predicting the future, one valuable insight was from the historian Ilan Pappé. He's now repeatedly made the very somber remark that although it's hard to see, but from a broad historical perspective, he said, this is the end of Zionism. This is the end of Israel. This is a very dramatic thing to say, but if you look at, I mean, the darkness, the horror of what we're seeing now may be the precursor to some future light. I mean, if you think of East Timor and elsewhere, maybe some resolution can come and may be easier to come after this horror, where the world may have to deal with it. I was a bit struck when he said that this is, if not in the near future, but in the not so far future, Zionism can't recover from this. In a way, I feel encouraged by that because it's been such a crime against the Palestinians from the earliest, from 1917. That's one thing to keep in mind. And I think things that Saul said and that I've been saying, the public appetite for supporting Israel is one of the reasons they're behaving so badly. One of the reasons you get these unbelievably extreme statements from Israeli representatives in the Jewish communities, as Saul said rightly, they've lost the public relations exercise. The world is turning against them and they see it. So that's one way to try to envision the future. The other thing to say is the world is not paying attention to the West Bank. And the West Bank is even worse than ever. I think it's over 400 people since October 7 have been killed, which is, increasing the rate of murders, extrajudicial, random people being shot all over the place. So the West Bank and the rampaging of the settlers is worse. So the West Bank has to be dealt with, and God knows I have no insight into how that can happen until, again, the international community decides that this has to end. I mean, Saul made the point earlier that the ICJ and the recent rulings have been ignored, but they ruled against the wall, the 2004 wall, whenever the wall was built. There was an ICJ ruling that and all the settlers were illegal. So they already had rulings that everybody ignored long ago. So this is maybe the crisis will lead, as it did, I always think of East Timor or South Africa for that matter. It'll depend on the world nations perhaps changing their approach and the popular uprising. Fortunately, around the world, it's to their great credit. It's hard to believe in Australia, in everywhere, huge crowds are still going out demonstrating every week. That's a sign of optimism that maybe, like with the Vietnam War, it was too slow, it took too long, but in the end, that may make and must make a difference. People are not going to go away. They're not leaving the demonstrations every week.
Thank you, Peter. Saul?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with with a lot of what Peter said and the general gist of it. I mean, in the short term, in the immediate term, it's a little bit difficult to predict what's going to happen because there are so many moving parts right now. What is Netanyahu and his band of fascists? What's going to happen with his coalition? Any Israeli prime minister is going to be probably just as bad, but perhaps not quite as overt, but just as bad. But still, having him around is obviously a negative point. The other thing that I think we have to keep our attention on, of course, is the American elections, because a lot depends on that. I do think that Biden is pretty much lost. I certainly don't see him being president again, which means another Trump presidency, as unbelievable as that might be. I personally, and I'm probably going to regret saying this, but I'm not 100% convinced that Trump is another Trump presidency would be entirely and 100% negative for the Palestinian people. And I say that because obviously the first presidency was awful. But the thing is, Trump he's not a principled guy. I mean, Biden has his principles. I mean, he, as far as I understand from people I speak with in Washington, D.C. and these kind of places, he honestly believes he is really a Zionist. I mean, this is his personal conviction, and he is, he honestly believes in the Zionist state of Israel, and he honestly believes that, Israel has to be protected and helped, and et cetera, et cetera. These are his personal beliefs. Those are his principles, as benighted as they might be. That's what he believes. But Trump has no beliefs. I mean, his beliefs are, his principles are, what's good for me at any given moment. What's good for me and my buddies? How can we make more money? That's all he believes in. I mean, this is the level of human being that we're talking about, about to reassume the most powerful position in the world, as sad as it might be. But that's the fact of it. And so if he can be shown, or if somehow the situation brings about some kind of change in that, and he believes that it's better for him and his cronies to abandon Israel, he will do it in a second. I mean, he will have absolutely no compunctions about doing that. So I'm not sure that it's entirely negative. I certainly don't have any ideas as to how to do that, and with his clearly sort of ridiculous buffoon son-in-law talking about, building waterfront resorts in Gaza. I mean, it's hard to be positive, but still, it may not be as negative as everybody fears. It's hard to say. But there are a lot of moving parts. It's very difficult to know what's going to happen. But certainly, I think in the mid to long term, there is no question. I mean, Peter, like you said, people are still coming out in the hundreds and thousands in support of Palestine, and people are abandoning support for Israel really in droves, and especially the young people. That is really, really important, because the young people are the future. The sort of old geezers like us. I may say
Be
that.
careful what you say.
Yeah, I'll be a little bit careful about that. But I mean, look, we're on our way out, sooner or later. But the young people are the future, and they have seen what Israel is about, and they don't like what they see. This is irrevocable. The trends are irrevocable, I believe. And especially in the United States, this is really going to make a big difference. So certainly in the mid to long term, I definitely see Israel becoming a pariah state, like South Africa. It won't even be invited to the Olympics. That will be the level. And then, when things rise to that level, then I really do think things will change. Inshallah, again, like you said, Peter, I mean, it's too late. We want it to happen yesterday. But certainly it definitely will happen. And the thing about the United States is that as corrupt and terrible as a lot of it may be, it does have the sort of capacity to change in a very sudden and dramatic way. It's a very violent country, and it can change in a very sort of dramatic, almost violent way. So inshallah, let's see. I mean, I hope we're not talking 20 years, 10 years down the road, even 5 years down the road. I do hope that we're talking very soon. But inshallah, let's see. Certainly in the mid to long term, that's how I see things coming. And there will be a just solution in Palestine, inshallah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So there is the hints of positive feeling about what may happen in the future.
Inshallah.
Things cannot be as bad as what is happening now cannot continue. There must be a change. But I can detect that the change will have to come from the people, the public all over the world, especially in America. Of course, we can't do anything much about what's happening in America, but the American publics are apparently very, very active in pushing for change, right? We, as you mentioned just now, hundreds of thousands of people coming out in demonstrations. Obviously, that is an indication of the emotion and their feeling about what's happening in Palestine. So it's important to make sure that more people will be pushing for change, and that is, I suppose, what our role is to contribute to change the perception of people all over the world, including in our own country. In Malaysia, we have BDS Malaysia and also Hashim Sani Center doing this, organizing this webinar in order to educate people, to make people become aware, and also to ask them to contribute to make things change over there in Palestine. Yeah. So thank you to both of you for your kind willingness to be a participant, to be the panelists, to speak to us again. Hopefully we will have another conversation in the future in better circumstances, inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nazari. Okay. Thanks, all. Good to see you guys.
Okay, good to see you. Good to see you. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.